happy Groundhog's Day, everybody. If you don't know the movie Groundhog's Day with Bill Murray, you must see it because it's a very important philosophical movie. I know that Groundhog's Day is not that important in Texas because you don't have much of a winter, but in the Northeast it really matters to us whether the groundhog sees his shadow. I'd also like to thank the organizers of today's conference, particularly Alejandro Barcenas and Ivan Marquez. Also want to thank my fellow presenters. This morning's panel was very interesting, and in some weird way, although I thought when I saw the titles that we would be getting very disparate papers, I actually think that we're going to be connecting in a lot of different ways. So I'll hopefully continue the discourse from this morning. I love it when all of the cool departments get together to sponsor an event. Those are always the best events. So thank you all for coming out for this today. The methodology that I want to use to reach a cross-disciplinary audience is one of highlighting two exemplary cases of Latin American thought. I'm going to talk about two figures who led incredibly interesting lives and made great contributions. They're just two of many I could have selected, but these are two of my favorites. So I want to use these two cases to sort of show the depth and breadth of feminist thought in Latin America and show the ways in which these figures had great impact on the development of feminist philosophy during their lifetime and after. First figure I want to talk about is Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz. She was a Mexican Baroque poet and philosopher, and she lived in the second half of the 17th century. Some have called her the 10th muse in the Spanish literary world. The Nobel Prize winner, Octavio Paz, has placed her self-reflective poetry in the same class as that of Rubén Darío, Emily Dickinson, and Walt Whitman. More relevant to the story that I am telling today, Sor Juana also had a first-rate philosophical mind and has become a powerful symbol for independent and socially exploratory thought in the Americas. Born in San Miguel Nepantla, Juana taught herself to read at age 3 and accompanied her older sister to school in an attempt to satiate her intense desire to learn. As a young girl, Juana moved to Mexico City in 1660 to live with her grandfather, where she took advantage of the opportunity to read the books in his library. 2 years later, she entered the court as a lady-in-waiting and quickly became known for her intelligence, which noted scholars famously verified. The viceroy and vicereine enabled Sor Juana's relative freedom of movement at the court and her contact with prominent scholars there. They also paid for her writings to be published in Spain. Sor Juana developed a close, lifelong friendship with the viceroy's wife, the Marquesa of Mancera. The Marquesa ultimately saved what still exists of Sor Juana's works, some 4 volumes of collected works, while officers of the Inquisition burned the rest of them. The Marquesa's crucial rescue of Sor Juana's writings has prompted scholars to wonder, are there any other Sor Juanas out there? Still to be discovered, perhaps, through searching around archives. The Latin American tradition has remained far too invisible in the mainstream philosophical community, and the women's voices within it have taken even longer to be recognized. The considerable price Sor Juana paid, ultimately, for her intellectual proclivities would hamper the discovery of other such figures. Yet the quality of Sor Juana's work provides ample motive for renewed efforts to search archives and elsewhere to uncover and rescue missing intellectual production by other women. Part of the silence of female voices in the Latin American intellectual tradition can be traced to the narrow options available to women in the colonial period. In the world of 17th century Mexico, in which women had only 2 lifestyle options, marriage or the convent, Sor Juana chose the option she perceived as the lesser of evils, the one that would give her the greatest independence. Still a teenager, she entered the convent of the Discalced Carmelites of St. Joseph in 1667, but left that order after 3 months. They were a little too strict for her. In 1669, she entered the convent of the Order of St. Jerome, which focused much more on charity and teaching, where she remained until her death in 1695. Sor Juana, along with many Mexican Jesuit priests, pursued independent perspectives, those that emphasized freedom of thought and action, in contrast to more traditional colonialist thought. A concern with exploratory thought pervades most of Sor Juana's poetry and prose. Her well-known long poem, First Dream, seeks unity of knowledge as she employs myriad images demonstrating her considerable erudition regarding Western thought and culture. Her famous poem, Foolish Men, questions the hypocrisy of men regarding sexual behavior, especially prostitution, and the Eve-Mary dichotomy many men seek to perpetuate. I'll just read the poem briefly, a verse from the poem. Which is more to be blamed, though both will have cause for chagrin, the woman who sins for money or the man who pays money to sin? So why are you men also stunned at the thought you're all guilty alike? Either like them for what you've made them, or make of them what you can like. That's the 1600s. Sor Juana, battling the primitive instincts of men during the colonial period, was certainly a thinker ahead of her time, and it took much courage to express her views, views that revealed the hypocritical stereotypes which trapped women into spaces that stunted their intellectual and moral growth. Sor Juana's writings put her at great risk for censure and punishment. Sor Juana's most famous essay, The Reply to Sister Filotea de la Cruz, resulted from a discussion with her longtime friend, the Bishop of Puebla, Manuel Fernandez de Santa Cruz, in which she expressed criticism of a well-known sermon given 40 years earlier by an eminent Portuguese Jesuit, Antonio de Vieira. The bishop, Sor Juana's friend, was impressed with her argument and requested that she put it in writing. Then, without Sor Juana's permission or knowledge, the bishop paid for her critique to be published and titled it The Missive Worthy of Athena. However, in an apparent contradiction, he simultaneously sent a letter to Sor Juana admonishing her for her intellectualism and suggesting that she comport herself more like the other nuns by devoting her time to religious rather than secular matters. He signed his letter with a pen name, Sor Filotea de la Cruz. The bishop was obviously not the friend Sor Juana thought him to be, since his letter left her open to attack from a rather misogynist establishment in the Mexico City of her day. The bishop benefited from the public circulation of Sor Juana's critique of the sermon because it coincided with his own negative assessment of Vieira, and because it helped him advance in his rivalry with the Archbishop of Mexico, Francisco Aguiar y Cejas, who was an admirer of Vieira, in addition to being well known for his misogyny. That a brilliant critique of Vieira's sermon had been written by a woman would have been heresy enough, but that Sor Juana was a nun also raised issues of religious authority and hierarchy. Sor Juana found herself entangled in the contentious relationship of two powerful figures in the church. Thus, it comes as no surprise that she was pressured to conform to traditional expectations for nuns by accepting the punishment of selling her substantial library and her musical and scientific instruments. After maintaining a silence of several months following the surprise publication of the Missive Worthy of Athena and receipt of the bishop's letter of admonition, and no doubt acutely aware of the greatly circumscribed space available to women in colonial times, Sor Juana wrote her now famous Reply to Sister Filotea de la Cruz. This title would have us believe that the reply was directed to another nun. However, this lengthy letter was intended for the bishop. Sor Juana cleverly and ironically picked up on the bishop having signed his missive Sor Filotea de la Cruz, a pen name he used to imply that Sor Juana should model her behavior on what a nun who truly loves God would do, because Filotea would be sister lover of God. This enabled Sor Juana ostensibly to appeal to Sor Filotea on a nearly level playing field, as a woman who would understand the many feminist arguments included in the reply. In typical Baroque fashion, Sor Juana capitalized on the masks the bishop's pen name afforded to employ plays on words and intricate conceits to critique indirectly many dogmatic practices of her time and to come close to questioning religious authority over intellectual pursuits, none of which she could have done directly if she had appeared to write to the bishop without the ruse of pretending he was Sor Filotea. Sor Juana's use of masks is evident, beginning with the salutation of her reply. It starts out, "My most illustrious lady," frequently using such excessive titles of respect whenever referring to Sor Filotea. Sor Juana carefully negotiates deference to authority. She does not forget that she is really writing to the bishop, while hiding behind the mask of writing to a woman, which affords her the ability to address topics she could not write directly to a male authority. Sor Juana opens the reply by writing about her need to find, quote, "an adequate way to thank you for a favor as undeserved as it was unexpected, committing my poor scribblings to print, a favor so huge as to surpass the wildest dreams or most ambitious hope, one that could never have entered my mind as a creature of reason, one of such magnitude, in a word, that not only does it defy confinement within the bounds of language, it exceeds the very capacity for gratitude in both scale and surprise. It is one of those that leave the beneficiary speechless." She is clearly able to use language cleverly to thinly veil her criticism of the bishop's behavior. In a discussion of the use of silence, readers can glean that Sor Juana may communicate as much through what she omits in her letter as through what she includes in it. Quote again, "Forgive, my lady, the digression wrung from me by the force of truth, and to tell the whole truth as a way of eluding the difficulty of answering. Indeed, I had almost made up my mind to let silence be my answer. Yet, since silence is something negative, although it explains a great deal by its insistence on not explaining, some brief label is needed to enable one to understand what it is intended to mean. Otherwise, silence will say nothing, since its function is precisely that, to say nothing." So in revisiting the silent, because it has been silenced, women's voice, and placing that voice into dialogue shortly with another Latin American thinker, Carlos Vaz Ferreira, I hope to have the silence say something, correcting the pernicious tendency of keeping the silenced voices from saying anything at all. The reply by Sor Juana is largely autobiographical. What little we know of her life comes primarily from this crucial letter. Sor Juana seeks, through her own example and the example of classical and biblical women, to defend a woman's right to education, knowledge, and reflection. She also manages to extract from St. Paul and St. Jerome passages that she uses to support a woman's right to be educated. The reply showcases Sor Juana's mastery of theology, but she devotes much of the letter to explaining how the study of the secular world enhances theology and is necessary for the understanding of theology. So she indirectly challenges the bishop's contention that she should devote herself solely to religious matters by proving her erudition in theology and church history at the same time as she demonstrates her mastery of many secular intellectual domains. Following St. Teresa of Avila, Sor Juana explains to Sor Filotea how she philosophizes even while cooking. She writes, quote, "If Aristotle had been a cook, he would have written much more," end quote. Ultimately, Sor Juana proves that devoting herself solely to religious matters would not serve to enhance her unparalleled knowledge or practices of them, but would only diminish her knowledge of the secular subjects that she had also mastered. In this sense, Sor Juana demonstrates that the bishop's suggestion that she limit her pursuits to the religious could only be interpreted as arbitrary and punitive. A few years after sending the reply to the bishop and after having parted with her books and instruments, Sor Juana succumbed to a plague while ministering to her sisters, and she died in April of 1695. Her last years were undoubtedly marked by frustration, fear, and repression, but the reply serves as an inspiring defense of her earlier participation in public life, her studies, and her poetry and prose writings. Okay, what I think that you might take away from this part of my paper is that the ways in which she defends intellectual autonomy, particularly for women, and indirectly questions authority that seeks to repress such an endeavor, have led many to champion her as a symbol of independent thought and an important precursor of culturally crucial developments soon to follow in the New World. Okay, now on to my second exemplary case. I want to begin with some biographical background on Vaz Ferreira. He was born in Montevideo, Uruguay, in 1872, and he died in that capital city in 1958. His father was a businessman who hailed from Valença do Minho in far northwestern Portugal. His mother was of Spanish and Portuguese ancestry. Vaz Ferreira's younger sister was the well-known poet Maria Eugenia Vaz Ferreira. In 1900, Carlos Vaz Ferreira married Elvira Raimondi, who was from a lower social class than he, and who had worked as a third-grade teacher. They built a large home on a corner lot in Montevideo and indulged their Rousseauian notions of nature by maintaining extensive gardens, a pond, and 4 enormous cages of exotic birds. They had 8 children, the 5 boys gravitating toward careers in science, and the 3 girls inclined toward philosophy. The interior of their house contained a large area where Elvira Raimondi homeschooled the children, a study and meeting room for Vaz, and a large room of Elvira's own in which she could lock herself when she needed to escape or entertain her friends. While Vaz Ferreira became increasingly prominent as a philosopher and educator, he rarely traveled away from home as he was committed to participating in raising his children. And he was cognizant of the fact that his wife shouldered a disproportionate share of that duty. Electing to be primarily homebound did not prevent him from maintaining a vibrant correspondence with other philosophers such as Miguel de Unamuno in Spain, another family man who chose to travel relatively infrequently. One measure of Vaz Ferreira's importance was that other intellectual figures, such as Albert Einstein, came to Montevideo to meet him. Vaz Ferreira was exceptionally dedicated to public education at all levels. In addition to being Uruguay's most prominent 20th century philosopher, he was arguably the most famous and public professor at the University of Montevideo. His Friday lectures were open to the public. Afterward, he would invite his students to his home for concerts. He was an avid collector of classical music. Almost all of his published work stemmed from lectures he gave at the university. When the lecture transcriptions were delivered to him, sometimes long after he gave the talks, Vaz Ferreira only occasionally had time to edit them. Most of his works were published as transcribed, which accounts for their conversational or spoken tone. Unfortunately, some of his lectures were not transcribed, or the transcriptions were lost along the way, notably a series of talks he gave on the French philosopher Bergson. In terms of intellectual ancestry, Vaz Ferreira's Living Logic, Lógica Viva, from 1910, descends from John Stuart Mill and Herbert Spencer. Spencer's influence was well entrenched at the University